Hello, this is Martin Scorsese, and I'll be speaking to you periodically through the course of this DVD about the making of Gangs of New York. On January 1st, 1970, that's 32 years ago, I was visiting some friends in Long Island, and they were house sitting a little cottage, and there was a fire in the fireplace, and they were reading Time and Again by Jack Finney, who had just been published. And I looked at the bookcases and all the books in the bookcases and that sort of thing, and ran across these titles. I don't know whose house it was. I still don't know whose house it was. And I saw this title, Gangs of New York, Herbert Asbury, and I took out the book and started reading through. When I saw it, I said, this would make an incredible film, some aspects of it. And so it's been since then. I've talked about it all the time. And around 75 or 76 is when I gave it to, I gave it to my friend Jay Cox immediately, actually, back around 71. And we talked about it for 4 or 5 years before we actually got together and started working, and since he started working on a script.
The rest I took from dreams.
This book seemed to give us the daily life or an impression of what it must have been like to be around at that time and to be living at that part of Manhattan. Granted, it's certainly non-fiction book, but it also is a book that deals not only with the real characters but also mythology of New York in a way. And so I found it fascinating. And I also found the period between the Revolution and the Civil War in America fascinating. How was the country really formed? You know, there were so many experiments. There were so many. It's still an experiment, American democracy. So the Republic, in a sense. So you have from the founding fathers. You have to the separation of the country, the secession of the South, the Confederacy. I was wondering what. I learned some of American history to a certain extent, but I didn't quite understand the daily struggle that would ultimately define the country, going back to, in the 1850s, the Dred Scott decision. All of that was we knew about, but we didn't really understand ultimately that until the end of the Civil War, 1865, the country was still, in a sense, being formed. It still is being formed now, but more so then. It's like the Revolution really finished in 1865, in a way. And New York played an important part of that. There were so many films that influenced this because it's so much a part of my life, this movie. The opening battle scene remained as it was. We didn't change it too much in the script, particularly the people coming out from below the ground in the 5 points, more symbolic of in a way, it goes back to something that's timeless, ancient Mesopotamian literature, Gilgamesh, all of this sort of thing in my mind over the years. That when a society breaks down, I was interested in how it starts up again, formed into tribes, families, I should say, and then the family units are formed into tribes, and the tribes have a leader, and then of course the tribe has to have a religion, the faith that binds them together, which gives them the fuel, so to speak, to fight for their survival. For example, in this film, ultimately Amsterdam and the others rally around the church, but the god that they rally around really is a war god, more of a Celtic war god, not the Jesus who preached love and peace, certainly, like most of us do at this point. Once you have a group of people battered into the ground, that they have no choice. They have nothing to lose. And faith binds them together, and the faith is usually a faith dealing with war, that fuels the flames of war, and that's what happens in this world. I wanted to show that at the beginning of the film. They come out from the underground. These people come right from the bowels of the earth. They represent every group that's ever been oppressed and every group that's ever been part of the dispossessed. They're the underground men. They're the men of the underworld. It's like the Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. They're the ones that are going to come out and ultimately create a day of judgment.
Is this it, priest? The Pope's new army? A few crusty bitches and a handful of ragtags?
I know, Bill. You swore this was a battle between warriors, not a bunch of Miss Nancys. So warriors is what I brought.
The O'Connell Guard! The Plumdugleys! The Shirtels! The Chichesters! The 40 Thieves!
Bene. On my challenge, by the ancient laws of combat, we are met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all who holds sway over the 5 points. Us natives, born rightwise to this fine land, or the foreign hordes defiling it.
By the ancient laws of combat, I accept the challenge of the so-called natives. You plague our people at every turn. But from this day out, you shall plague us no more. For let it be known that the hand that tries to strike us from this land shall be swiftly cut down.
Then may the Christian Lord guide my hand against your Roman popery.
Prepare to receive the true Lord.
The opening battle scene itself, a series of intercuts of people fighting. The great inspiration for that was probably the best battle scene put on film was Chimes at Midnight, Orson Welles. And I believe they shot that for many weeks. Bits and pieces. That's what we wound up doing too. We shot the majority of the opening sequence in 3 weeks. And then Vic Armstrong, who's an extraordinary action director, he took drawings of mine and basically did them for another 6 or 7 weeks, bits and pieces every day when the sun was right, with small groups of men. And I basically, in his direction, I had designed a lot of the shots, and specifically in the editing pattern. Particularly, you could see that when Hellcat Maggie flies through the frame and lands on the back of another fighter, and she bites his ear off. Those shots were exactly as drawn, and he would get them for me. I'd come over and check them because I was able to move anywhere I wanted on that set because we owned it. I had a golf cart, and I just go between units, and that was kind of exhilarating and exciting. But I'm always fascinated by Russian montage. I happen to like editing, and particularly the 1920s, the montage of 1920s. And in Eisenstein's Potemkin, there's a scene where a sailor, yes, of course, the editing and the Odessa step sequence and all that, we were all aware of that. But I was interested in the breaking up of the imagery, almost like Cubist painting in a way, and or like a choreography by Nijinsky, in a strange way, because there's a scene where a sailor is washing a plate and he sees that it says on it, "Give us this day our daily bread," and they had just had almost an insurrection on the boat about the meat that was being served to the sailors, which was rotten and filled with maggots. And he was very bitter about it, so he looked at the dish, kept looking at the dish, and then he took the dish, raised it above his head, and smashed it against the sink. And I don't know, there might be about 7 or 8 cuts in that sequence. And what I was interested in is that somehow in the smashing of the dish was not the main component of the action. The main component was his arm, and particularly his arm when it completed the motion. I think they cut to it 3 times, maybe. Top of his shoulder, a striped shirt he's wearing. And the arm at rest had such power to it. And that's the kind of imagery I wanted, and the kind of editing ultimately I wanted. When Vic Armstrong was shooting the bits and pieces for me of different action, I told him to, he would show me an action, I'd say, okay, now do that track left to right, and or vice versa, or track in and out. Always keep the camera moving, and start the shot with 48 frames per second, go down to 12 frames, and come back up to 24. Now do the shot again, and just do the opposite. And so we got bits and pieces that, in my mind with Thelma, I was telling her stuff that we would normally cut out, stuff that we would normally throw away, the completions of action. Therefore, in the editing, it's all suggested. You never see a knife going in a person. I don't think so anyway. That's the way I cut it with Thelma, and that's what I was striving for. There have been some people I know who say, well, the film is too violent. Another person, I heard this, overheard, people didn't know I was listening to them, they didn't know it was me. And the person, that's not violent, they'd say it's bloody. It gives you the idea of violence, but it's not really a violent film. But you're dealing with, that's true, blood is in the streets constantly. And you're dealing with a world that, I grew up where a world where violence was an option. There's no, as they say today, there was no doubt about that. But in this particular world that I'm depicting, violence was an everyday occurrence of all kinds. Domestic, street, gangland, everything. And so this is so much a part of the fabric of the film that you had to find a way to give the impression of that without constantly dwelling on it, you know. And so that's why it was edited like that. And that's, if you look at the film, there's even when Monk is killed with this with the knife from Bill, it's you don't see it happen. You really don't. It happens as Monk is walking towards us. But that was the nature of trying to convey a world that was so tough. And this is very important because violence in the movies I made over the years, I've done violence in a pretty flat, straightforward way. I just didn't know how else to do it except the way I did it in Mean Streets and Taxi Driver and Goodfellas and Casino. But by the end of Casino, the killing of Joe Pesci and his brother and a string of killings in Las Vegas, I didn't... in my mind, I think, it's very important to depict this lifestyle, and you have to show the downside, and this is the downside of it. And you have to be honest with it. I just think you have to be honest in the portrayal of violence and not glorify it, but just put yourself in that position, and to understand the brutality of it, and particularly the killing, let's say, of Pesci and his brother at that point by his best friends, simply with bats. It was with baseball bats. The brutality is primeval, and I think I don't want to make it stylish anymore, but I didn't want to fall into a cause and effect of a violent movement, and you see the effect graphically. I wanted to suggest it with camera moves, camera speed, speeding up and down, that sort of stuff. And also I was interested in the movement and the creation of a kind of confused, futile, primeval world. Everything, just the futility of the fight itself. And you add to that the music that we put on. There was a piece by Peter Gabriel called Signal to Noise, which is pretty interesting, and I think you get a sense of what I was trying. There's no reason to be kind of literal. I don't want to be literal at all in the movie. There are times when I do go, throughout the picture, all the source music, in a way, is very, very accurate, as much as possible. But in terms of the Gabriel piece at that point, it's more like a dirge, more like an elegy in a way.
In this place, you have grown from a boy into a man. Put to death the earthly things in you, immorality, impurity, passion, vengeance. The Lord has forgiven you. You also must forgive. You go forth to a country torn apart by civil strife.
Thank you, Reverend.
Lend your hand to the work that yet remains, that this war may end, and the plague of slavery that brought this conflagration down upon us vanish forever from the earth.
With this particular film, it's been stop and start over the years, over 30 years. In the end of the 70s, we thought it was time to make it. And everything changed. After making Raging Bull, things were quite different. And the system changed, Hollywood changed, and the necessary, the budget that we needed for this particular film was certainly not going to the kind of picture that we wanted to make at the time. And so during the 80s, we sort of put it aside, and I followed the path of another picture, Last Temptation of Christ, trying to get that made, which I finally did get made at the end of the 80s. And right at the same time, finishing up Goodfellas, which was released in 1990. And right around when we were doing Goodfellas, and we realized now may be the time again for Gangs in New York, I took the script with me to Japan in 1989 to do some work there with Akira Kurosawa, one of his last films. And while we were waiting to shoot, It was a typhoon, so in the hotel, in this small hotel in Hokkaido, I took out the script and read it then, and said, "I see now. Let's get back into this project. Let's revise it. Let's see if we can get it made." So around 1989, 1990, we revised it again, and it was almost possible to get it made then. But again, it was a number of reasons, different reasons why, combination of factors. It just didn't get made. And then finally, by 1999, the suggestion was made again, and in this case, having the possibility of Leonardo DiCaprio helped us. Because Leo is an actor that I've been looking at for a number of years. My friend Robert De Niro told me about working with him in This Boy's Life. And Leo was 16 years old, and De Niro usually tells me things only when I ask him about, would you recommend so-and-so? Who would you recommend for a part like this, or whatever? I give him a script, and he would give me ideas in the script, and he does the same with me over the years. And so he volunteered this information about DiCaprio as a young boy. He said, this is some kid you're going to have to work with someday. He's quite good and a lot of potential. So back around 94, 95, I knew about him. And then, of course, I saw him in What's Eating Gilbert Grape. I thought remarkable, moving, and people, whenever I'd be on the set, people walk by, people on the crew, friends of mine, electricians, Grip says, "Yeah, you got to work with this kid DiCaprio. He's young yet, but when he gets older, it's going to be really interesting." It's like, yeah, maybe you can work on something. I say, yeah, okay. And then De Niro would keep telling me this too, and so I wound up. It's a long story, but basically, the Gangs of New York had been in preparation for many years. It went through many transformations. And when I was on the set of a film I was making in 1999 called Bringing Out the Dead, my old friend Mike Ovitz came to visit me on the set. We were working at nights, and he was having lunch with me at 1 in the morning. And he said, "What do you want to do next?" And we were talking about this other project I had, but things didn't seem to be going well. But he said, "Why don't you do Gangs of New York?" I said, "All right." He said, "I got this Leo DiCaprio." I said, "Yeah, it'd be perfect." So that was the moment where he said, "You've always wanted to make that." And Mike was a guy who said the same thing to me about a film I made in 1987, 88 called Last Temptation of Christ, which was also a picture, although for different reasons, had problems being made. But when I met Mike Ovitz for the first time, he said, "What do you really want to make?" I said, "Well, it's Last Temptation of Christ." He says, "Okay, let's see if we can get it going." And it got made. And he's been that way through my career. Being a kind of catalyst that way, or a diviner in a way, who would just come in and suddenly how these things would almost impossible to make all came together. And I went over with to Mike's agency at the time and met Leo, and so all of this came together at that point, and then we began to have some flesh and blood on Amsterdam. Because prior to that, couldn't figure quite the. Usually have an easier time with the villainous characters rather than the quote heroes unquote in a way. But in any event, that. By the time we got to make the film, the fact that Leo DiCaprio was able to come on board was one of the major reasons the film got made. And if Leo DiCaprio has power to get a film made because of his bankability due to Titanic, I found certainly in my estimation putting it to good use, because he put it to Gangs of New York in a sense.
Mulberry Street and Worth, Cross and Orange and Little Water. Each of the 5 points is a finger. When I close my hand, it becomes a fist. And any time that I wish, I can turn it against you.
I understand, but we're talking about different things. I'm talking about civic duty. Responsibilities we owe to the people. Schools and hospitals, sewers and utilities, street construction, repairs and sweeping, business licenses, saloon licenses.
People who are quibbling about whether a cave existed, and I'm telling you that you tell me, you can argue me in terms of people have argued me about it. Well, was there a cave? Yes, there are caves. Have you ever gone down to the tenement to turn when the fuse goes off on Elizabeth Street in 1955 when the fuses went out, and you have to go down the basement to put a new fuse in? First of all, you had to be armed because of the rats, and you found below there were more. I think what they did, you see, I know that the Italians used the sub-basements, not just the basement, the sub-basements for storage, but mainly for making wine, which was very important. I do know, and I actually saw it happen, that some basements have so many how should I put it? secret ways. A person who is a thief, let's say, or somebody's chasing him or her, go into a basement on Mulberry Street and come out on Elizabeth somehow, or come out in the backyards down by the church. This was all done for protection, and I've been below. And I mean, go to the Chinese area. I tell you now that there are places below the ground where people are working, way below the ground.
Who are you? Hey. No. I said, who are you? What are you doing here? I just like it down here is all. See what's in his pockets, Jimmy. Now look, boys, I really don't want to fight.
The area of the 5 Points really reflected the breakdown of civilization, that many tried to keep a family together, but many of them were not given jobs, and they would just disintegrate, so to speak. The family just into drunkenness and all kinds of terrible situations that occurred down there. That place was maybe 40,000 people living in a very small area, everybody crowded around each other and on top of each other. So it was almost like a post-apocalyptic world where people had to redefine what living really is.
You're the priest's son, aren't you? You, get away from me, understand? Don't remember me, do you? That's the one tried to help you. What? That's the one tried to help you when the natives took you. Oh, that was you?
I was working closely with Joe Reedy and Michael Ballhaus about Johnny's tour of the 5 Points. The choice that I was trying to make was whether the cutaways to the gangs that Johnny is describing should be done in different parts of the city, or should all be there in Paradise Square, which was a big choice to make because of the number of extras involved and how to shoot that. It was not a matter of anything else, not a matter of what action that they were doing, any kind of fighting they were doing. It was a matter of where to shoot these different gangs. We do mention the Swamp Angels. There was a thought, for example, of showing the Plug Uglies fighting at the fish market. The fish market is over by the pier. But we decided not to. I decided to put it all in Paradise Square as if it's happening in Paradise Square at the moment. The biggest question came into play with the river pirates, one of the groups called the Swamp Angels. You're not robbing a ship during the day. You're doing it at night. But the insert would be such a quick shot, and it'd be so far off Paradise Square that it might come in. It might visually be disorienting, because in a sense, a lot of the gang activity in my film was simplified so that much of it took place in Paradise Square and the 5 Points. But the seaport is somewhat outside of the 5 Points. And the big decision at that moment was whether to literally go all around the city or condense it and confine it to the 5 Points, sort of make a metaphor for the rest of the city in a way.
The Lanchesters are nothing but a bunch of rapacious grab-ups. The true blue Americans call themselves a gang, but all they really do is stand around on corners damning England.
I think, this picture is sort of, I've made a lot of films that take place in New York. It's a city that I prefer. It's a city I choose to live in. A city I was raised in and grew up in. And a city which marked me and still does. And so I'm always fascinated by, I'm fascinated by history, and I'm fascinated by the history of America and also the history of the city. And so, in a sense, this film sort of represents a foundation upon which all my other movies are based, in a way. It sort of creates a world in which the worlds I depict in Mean Streets and Goodfellas and Raging Bull, to a certain extent, Taxi Driver, it's the foundation from which those worlds emerged. And yes, there's no doubt this is based on history. There's no doubt about it. But it is still a film that is more of an opera than history. The history is a touchstone in a way that we could go back to. That certain facts we can make sure are accurate. Other facts we combine. Other certain characters we combine it two or three people into one person. Leonardo DiCaprio's character represents a whole generation of people, in a way, a new generation of immigrant. Daniel Day-Lewis's character represents the old, intransigent, conservative, nativist or chauvinist way of thinking. And it tries to create a period of time where, in a sense, not the whole city wasn't like this, but this was a sort of a festering wound in the city that allowed to continue in the way we see in the film, automatically, I should say ultimately results in the city blowing up like a powder keg. And if we're most historically accurate, it's to the nature of the anarchy and the chaos. That, I think, is important. Certainly it's about a period in American history, particularly the history of New York City, that is very, underreported, so to speak, particularly by the newspapers of note at that time, up to 1863, 1865, and maybe up to late 1860s and the beginning of the 1870s is when they started really paying attention to that area, and there's a lot written about it. But a lot of it comes down through folklore and hearsay and some facts, which I'm sure have been embellished. And so we took that as a cue, in a way. The facts themselves, if they were facts at all, were somewhat embellished. There's no doubt that lifestyle existed. That I know for a fact. I also grew up in an area that had a similar kind of lifestyle, albeit a different century. But I also understand it. I also understand it a lot. So I took those elements and took those facts, which first of all, that have been proven to be facts by other research that we did, other sources. But to take that and to understand, first you're going to take this period of time, create some characters based on the certain characters of the period, based on some characters, not really the same characters, and heighten it very much the same way as, let's say, when My Darling Clementine, directed by John Ford, is about the Earp brothers, Wyatt Earp, Virgil, a few others, and they're in Tombstone, Arizona. His relationship with Doc Holliday primarily, and of course the Clantons, which leads to the gunfight at the OK Corral. Now, if you look at My Darling Clementine, from what I understand, which is one of my favorite films, and of course deals with a different aspect of history, American history, and deals with a different approach too, certainly. But in a sense, you can say that this is inspired by those events, that the actual choreography of the gunfight at the OK Corral in that particular film is much more elaborate than I think that really happened at that gunfight. And I think it lasted less than a minute. Particularly, I think 5 or 6 men facing each other with guns firing away. It's not going to last that long. And so, in a sense, we hope it to be a worthy contender to, the approach that Ford and the others took to history in terms of My Darling Clementine, and pictures like that, Now, I take that as a generic backdrop about the poor, and about people who are oppressed, about people who are fighting for individual freedom, for people who are trying to find a decent life for themselves and can't get past the 5 points. Now, you can do anything you want from there. You could have a building that has inside what seems to be a bar. You have people singing and dancing, some old women in the corner doing needlework, and at the same time, carcasses of meat hanging and butchers working on the meat. Bill the Butcher is based on a real character named Bill the Butcher Poole. However, because Bill Poole was killed in 1856, we changed his name to William Cutting because we have him die during the draft riots for the dramatic purpose of the story. And that should give you an indication of the ratio between the fiction, or what I like to call the opera, so to speak, in this picture, the heightening of the reality, as opposed to the actual historical fact, as opposed to certain films that are made based on actual historical fact. This is an impression of a surreal time almost, particularly in the use of certain sequences in the film, particularly in whatever takes place in what we call Sparrow's Chinese Pagoda. Now, Sparrow's Chinese Pagoda was the name of a big institution at that time, a saloon, so to speak, but I think from the 1880s, and we took that name and moved it up. So we took a sense of the color of the time and used whatever facts we felt in terms of that were more generic to the period. Yes, we have characters like William Tweed, who later became the famous Boss Tweed, who's the name now. Whenever they mention corruption in America, everybody knows Boss Tweed. But at this point in the film, played by Jim Broadbent, he's just becoming Boss Tweed in a way. But he's wonderfully corrupt, and even a couple of times P.T. Barnum comes in. But we have P.T. Barnum. We kind of move him around into worlds that maybe he wasn't totally in, but could have been. We were trying to create almost like a heightened sense of reality, coming out of history, which is created from a kind of breakdown of civilization. In a way, the 5 points area to me represents, in a sense, a breakdown of civilized society, what civilized society was supposed to be, something that America was aspiring to, but with killing each other on battlefields. And if it's most accurate, it's to that frame of mind.
Not my favorite tune. Thank you, Vice. You keep out of trouble now.
In the case of the music for the film, I really had in mind originally the type of soundtrack I created for Mean Streets or Goodfellas or Casino. Of course, there were no recorded pieces of music at the time, but we've come across in research examples of the music that was played at the time, the type of songs, the lyrics, etc. The New York Historical Society and other outlets have this sort of thing. Plus, there are recordings from the 1920s, 30s that have indications of older music from the 1880s, maybe. So we slip in a little, anachronistically, a little touch of blues at times. But that was a suggestion as to where the music was going to go. And if you were on a street corner, it's very hard to say, since nobody was around, exactly what was heard in those street corners. It's really the mixture of English, Irish, Scottish folk music with African. And that's what I was concerned about. So in a sense, Robbie Robertson was able to compile over a period of time many discs, many CDs of all sorts of folk music and African chants, everything that he got his hands on, or modern music or other elements of just interesting pieces that he thought might be interesting as a feel. He used to use the word as a feel for certain scenes. And through the course of a year, I listened to all of that, then compiled what I liked most from those. We put them into the computer, the editing computer, the Lightworks, and then broke them up in different ways, saying, okay, this is African, this has elements of blues, this is Irish English, this is Scottish, and we started to blend, and then I started making the notes for Thelma exactly which piece of music to try in which scenes. And but this came through a very long process of about a year and a half of listening to a great deal of stuff that Robbie had sent, and also other people gave me, but primarily Robbie. And so that was the source of the sound of the movie, ultimately. And we took everything, even classical music, threw it all in.
Where are you going, boy? I'm here to pay tribute to Bill.
Where are you now? Yeah, give it to me. I'll give it to him.
No, thanks. I'll give it to him myself.
Oh. What do you want to keep? The money or your teeth boil? John. Welcome.
For me, me lad, sir.
Daniel Day-Lewis, I worked with him on in 1992 on Age of Innocence, and we had a very good working relationship. He, in effect, became Newland Archer, the character he's playing in Age of Innocence. When I say became, it's always it sounds like something magical in a way, or hypnotic. But in a sense, he does become the character, or at least his version of the character. And what that does, and this is one of the reasons I imagined him as Bill, the Butcher. Myself and Jay Cox were talking about it when we were writing together Age of Innocence, and Jay looked up and said, imagine if we ever get Gangs of New York made, imagine what Daniel Day-Lewis could do with Bill the Butcher character. And I said, oh, that would be something. But as I've stated many places, Gangs of New York took many years to pull together, and we never got quite to the point where we really were at the starting gate to really even talk to actors, or let alone think about who could play Amsterdam or Jenny. Jay Cox did remind me, however, that in the early 70s, when we always talked about doing Gangs of New York, before he even set pen to paper, we greatly admired Malcolm McDowell, particularly because it was in two films in the early 70s, or late 60s, early 70s. A film called If, directed by Lindsay Anderson. It was an extraordinary picture, and we were taken by McDowell at that point. And, of course, Clockwork Orange. That's the only time I can remember discussing an actor, and I had forgotten it. Jay had reminded me of this. But the first one that came to mind with Bill the Butcher was through Jay saying maybe Daniel Day-Lewis at one point in time. But in any event, Daniel had sort of been on retreat from acting, studying shoemaking in Florence under a great shoemaker, a great master there. May have been a couple of years or a year and a half of his life, I think. In any event, it was pointed out that he didn't want to work again in film or in theater. And Harvey Weinstein and Leo DiCaprio and myself were talking, and Jay Cox too. And basically, his name came up, of course, immediately. And as well, I don't think he's working anymore. But Harvey said, "Why don't you just call him?" You know, last time I had seen him was at a screening of Kundun that I invited him, Daniel and his wife Rebecca to. In any event, we did call. I sent him the script. He called back. He was very polite, but he was non-committal. And so Harvey Weinstein, which is was a strong point with Harvey, he sort of pushed the issue and said, "Well, I'll fly him in for 3 days," and which is what he did. And Harvey told him, "Daniel, do me a favor, don't do this part because I want to win the Academy Award. I want to play it." That's what Harvey told him. So they have a relationship going back to My Left Foot, the Jim Sheridan picture, and that goes way back to, I think, 1992 or something, 91, whatever. But in any event, Daniel did come in. Leo DiCaprio, myself, and Harvey stayed with him for 2 to 3 days. We talked, showed him all the research. Admittedly, the script was still being worked on and developed, and we talked a little about the character. And finally, we went to dinners, and it's the old story, in a way. We really admire him so much. We wanted him to be a part of this journey that we were going to take. It was more like an expedition on this movie. And so we told him we loved him and want to be with him, and we'll support him, and he'll support us, we're sure. We were sure of that. And Leo had never really met Daniel before, but expressed his great admiration for him, etc. In any event, the day before he left, I was going through some research pictures, and the book opened to an engraving of the real Bill the Butcher, Bill Poole, and it looked just like Daniel. And I said, "Look at that, it's fated. You have to do this." And so that's how it began. And eventually, when he did fall into character, he developed falling into character, really. It went over a period of time, a couple of months, I think, along with developing the accent with Tim Monick, who was our dialect coach. And with that, when I realized ultimately I was more, after a certain point in time in rehearsals and discussions and pre-production, I was talking more often to Bill than to Daniel. It made me feel very comfortable because I got to like Bill a lot, and so did Leo. And we felt that, in a sense, we were bypassing a kind of an actor's process. The process of the actor with Daniel it made me feel very comfortable, as if the character was really alive and existing right there in front of our eyes, and we were experiencing this person every day. Although with him, he had pointed out, last week we were talking, he pointed out that usually the character has to find him, has to let himself be known to him. And so he just becomes, after about 2 or 3 weeks, you find that whatever moves he's making, suggestions for an improv or something, is coming from the character who's now sort of permeating his being, in a way. So when he talks to you, when he talked to me, like off camera or just even on the telephone, it's no longer as Daniel, and it's not some magical process. It's just it just happens to be the way he goes through it. And I think it pulled together when he started trying on the clothes and working out his mustache, and also the hairstyles. We had developed the hairstyle period of two or three different hairstyles we tried 2 or 3 weeks before shooting. We settled on one, which you see in the film. A little bit, I recall that there may have really, people have been asking about overt influences on Bill's character from other movies. No, aside, not for me, but aside from the films I made over the years, where the main character is usually a person who's not a hero or a total villain, but a mixture of both, and sometimes leaning towards a person who is not considered a normal film hero, like a Jake LaMotta or Travis Bickle, Paul Schrader's creation, Travis Bickle and Taxi Driver, and that sort of thing. Naturally, I lean more towards the quote villainous side, unquote, and I think the only interesting association I had about Bill was just a visual association. That was with the character of the villain in the French classic Les Enfants du Paradis. Now, I forget the man's name, I forget the character's name, I forget the actor who played the part. But his hairstyle reminded me of that, costumes to a certain extent. And in fact, a lot of the picture had reference to the French street underworld, which was depicted in Les Enfants du Paradis. And also Dominique Vandenberg, who was one of our technical advisors and is also acts in the film as one of the associates of Amsterdam and the other young boys, Shang and all the others. And Dominique, who doesn't have dialogue in the film, but he's always present, he was a veteran of the French Foreign Legion, and he's Belgian. And he basically worked out with everyone, and technical advisors and stunt coordinators, the French 18th century street fighting method or technique called savate. And so, in a funny way, we were dealing with the French underworld, which you later see in a wonderful film, which takes place, I think, in the 1890s, called Casque d'Or, directed by Jacques Becker. Daniel also then was able to improvise in the film certain gestures, moves. For example, the tapping of his glass eye with the point of a knife was an improvisation that he felt he should do. A scene that I like a great deal, where he's interrogating Happy Jack, basically telling him to go and beat up this young boy, Amsterdam, to keep him in line, and his breakdown, his crying, his mock crying, filled with such rage that he had to be rather theatrical about it to make his point to Happy Jack. This was a total improvisation. He told me at one point during one of the takes, right before we did one of the takes, he says, I have an idea. I think it's kind of crazy. I said, don't tell me, just do it. And that's what he did. And there was a great deal of improvisation in that scene. Other things were improvised. For example, his reaction when he throws a knife into the locket in the scene in which he's throwing the knives at Jenny, and he says, whoops-a-daisy. And that was a definite improv. Throughout the film, there are moments like that with him.
I was raised in a very similar establishment myself. Now everything you see belongs to me, to one degree or another. The beggars and newsboys and quick thieves here in paradise, sailor dives and gym mills and blind tigers on the waterfront, the anglers and amusers, the she-he's and the chinks. Everybody owes, everybody pays, because that's how you stand up against the rising of the tide. Is that right, boys?
Yeah, Bill, that's right.
Enlist! Join up! Serve your country! Come on in out of the draft, boys! Volunteer and get your $50 bonus!
We need 30,000 volunteers, and we're prepared to pay $677 per volunteer. Please read this. Thank you. Would you like to take one of these, please, to fill out? 3 square meals a day.
I think Jenny's an interesting character because she represents the kind of woman that was coming out of the points. In majority of them died young. A lot of them died young, men and women. Women more so. Women had less of a chance to really do much in the underworld there. And aside from prostitution, aside from thievery of any kind, some starting very, very young, 5, 6, dying when they're 10, 9, whatever. I guess by the time they were 20, they looked 80. You know, but around the time of the Civil War, some of the women were getting more sophisticated with their crime, and Jenny represents one of those. She was taking the crime outside the 5 points, going into areas in which she was playing a scam, confidence, what they would call later confidence game, confidence men. She was one of the characters that we gave this element to represent. This is what the underworld will be like later, you know. And actually, it did become like that in the late 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It became more sophisticated, more complicated, and the confidence man became a key figure. Today, you know, like credit card scammers or pyramid schemes and things like that or hackers on computers today. She represents sort of the beginning of that. And also a person who knows that if I save enough money, if I get enough loot, one of the things I like to do is, it's amazing I've survived this long and that I look well. I still look pretty good. Let me get out of town. Let me leave this place. There's nothing really in it for me anymore. You know, and the only way, you have to understand at that time, the only way they could leave was, it's not that easy to leave a city like that, an area like that in the city. And don't forget, particularly during the Civil War, where were the railroads? There was no transcontinental railroad. Most of the railroads are being used for the Union soldiers. ship. Well, where would you go? Can't go south. There's a war. You can go past the south, I guess, get past the blockade somehow, and go around the tip of South America, come all the way up to San Francisco, get in a boat from San Francisco, then go to the Yukon, and try your luck. What still was happening at the time, America was still undergoing sort of the gold rush from the 1849 period.
For every lay, we had a different name. An angler put a hook on the end of a stick to drop behind store windows and doors.
I did have to put our new daughter in the film, somewhere, I thought. But I didn't want to put her in the 5 points because it was so dirty. And quite honestly, after 2 weeks of working in those sets and rain and all sorts of things, they became very lived in. The streets became very muddy. I just decided that wasn't the best place for the little one to be. She wasn't able to walk at the time yet, but she learned while we were there in Rome. But I decided that the only place she could probably be in the film is when Amsterdam gets a glimpse of how the other half lives. And, of course, in order for her to be in the frame, we'd have to be in the frame with her. And therefore, I appear as what some people have criticized me as becoming an upper-class person for some reason, identifying with that. That's not the case because of the kid. I would have liked to dress more like one of the natives. I thought that would be interesting downtown, you know. Let my beard grow a little bit, you know what I mean, for about a week or two. That would have been nice. But I must say, though, that making this film was so complex, I didn't have time to be in front of the camera. So if you do something that you're going to be in front of the camera for, it's best just to be seated at a table.
Listen, don't do that. Go back to the points and leave me to my business, or I will open your throat, so help me God.
All right. Go on, then.
Cameron Diaz was recommended to me by Joe Roth when Disney was doing the film. I had only seen her in There's Something About Mary. Then I saw her, and they showed me a rough cut of Being John Malkovich, and I thought she was quite good. I didn't necessarily, it's hard for me sometimes to follow the modern movies that are made, so I didn't necessarily know Cameron Diaz as a comedienne, but as an actress, mainly. And so I met her a few times, a couple of meetings we had, but over a long period of time, because the film was, as far as I was concerned, it was such a dream come true that I didn't believe it. I never believed that the picture would get made, even to the point on August 1st, 2000, when we flew to Rome to live there. I still thought, no matter if the sets were built, anything could happen in this business. And so I didn't pay too much attention to it. Ultimately, we did do auditions. And I said, if Cameron would agree to audition, then it'll be fine, you know. By that point, Harvey Weinstein was involved with the film. And so Harvey took it upon himself to get a film that could not be made. Especially, he's a great fan of mine, and we're friends over the years, doing lots of work together on different restorations, presentations of certain films, or whatever. And anyway, Ellen Lewis is my casting director, and we had Leo DiCaprio in the room. And basically, we auditioned about 20 or 30 young women. And then Cameron Diaz came in for an audition, and we talked for a little while before. And then she came in the room and started doing a scene with Leo, an old scene, a scene that is in the film now. After she's caught by him, she's stolen his medal, and they walk along uptown in New York, and they talk a little bit. And I found that as soon as she started, something happened. Not only was she bright and exciting to look at and listen to, and she had a certain energy and a great sense of humor, it also created something for Leo DiCaprio. I saw something happen to him, that he started engaging her with the same dialogue that he had worked with other young women with, using the same dialogue, but that he wasn't necessarily, I didn't see the chemistry with other people the way I saw with the two of them, and I was very heartened by that. And so ultimately we decided to go that way.
A glimpse of America.
Fellini's Satyricon is certainly an inspiration for this movie, and maybe in the early 70s it was even, in my mind, going more towards that kind of thing, where, as Fellini pointed out, science fiction in reverse. Danilo Donato, his great production designer and costume designer, he said, it's as if we're going in the streets of Rome at night, and we look down on the old cobblestones, and we happen to pry one loose. You lift it up, and what do you find below? You find the ancient Romans crawling around, and that's exactly what I had tried to do in Gangs. Give you the impression as if you lift up a stone, or if there's some excavation going on in the city, and you look below and you discover this whole world, but it's all alive.
Is that man drunk?
Oh, that is Good Friday, miss.
Good day to you, Mulroney.
I always felt that Bill the Butcher would be a dandy in the way he dressed, and that's really based on Bill the Butcher Poole, Bill Poole, the real Bill the Butcher. He was originally a butcher, and the butcher was the sort of the royalty of the merchant class in a way. They were considered the most important vendors because the meat had to be sold immediately and that sort of thing. And he was a big gambler and threw money around, and everybody kind of liked Bill. He was a flashy dresser, and this is real.
In any event, he was the character written about in the Gangs of New York book is certainly one of the more flamboyant. I think one of the first really flamboyant. I put quotes around the word gangster because gangster we think of today, thinking in terms of the 20th century. I think of these guys were way before that, and they represented something different, and the country was something different too. Really, the country was still being formed, and so I think. They had gangs. I think the gangs were loosely formed, too. I think gang members could be, in terms of the Irish gangs, a gang member could go from the Swamp Angels to the Dead Rabbits, maybe, and back and forth to others. You had some people turning sides, too, certainly, like the way Happy Jack does as a policeman in Gangs of New York, the film. But Bill Poole was pretty much known at the time as a very, very powerful force for Native Americans. And I don't mean the Indian Native American, I mean the Anglo-Dutch. There probably is, maybe unfair to say Anglo-Dutch, because I think whatever that American stock was that came from the 17th century and had made a foothold here in America and fought in the Revolution and fought in the War of 1812, that was considered, in a sense, a nativist American, I think. Of course, I wanted to make him a main character in the story, and when I realized that I wanted to have however the story was going to play itself out, I wanted it to be against the backdrop of the draft riots. And the draft riots lock us into an historical date that we can't take liberty with. I have Bill Poole dying at that time in 1863, but it's quite evident, and it was known, the factual evidence, that he died in 1856 or 1857, shot at the Stanwix Hotel, which had just been open a week or so on Broome and Spring. I think from Mr. Baker, with some basically sort of a ballroom brawl situation, and Baker went out and left and said he'd be back to shoot him, and it took him about 3 hours to find a gun, and nobody would go back with him either. He was trying to get all these people to go back and fight, and he came back, and there was more kind of rowdiness and fighting, and eventually guns went off, and Bill got shot, but he didn't die for 5 days. And this is Bill Poole, and during that 5 days his friends were sort of realizing first of all, they were trying to, I think, work out his last words, his last statement. And they came up with, "Goodbye, boys. Thank God I die a true American." That's what he supposedly said. He, in a sense, you can stretch it and say he had the first great gangland funeral. Apparently there were 10,000 people who attended, and this extraordinary amount of flowers and wagons going by. And so what they tried to do was to make an example of him as a nativist martyr, in a way, being assassinated by Irishmen.
We changed his name to Bill Cutting because the Daniel character is just an combination of a number of tough characters of that time in the 1850s in New York. But the fact that Bill Poole was the head of was a major nativist and a bigot, but considered himself a real American, a true American. This was important. I thought that we would change the name and use this. We only changed the name to be technically in the clear.
Bill! Mr. Cologne will work out the details. Thank you, gentlemen. That's how we do things around Tammany, gentlemen. Who's this, then?
Thank you, boys.
Good day, sir. You got something on your mind? Bill's taken quite a liking to you. Now, if you're up to something, Benny, only I don't want no part in it. I was in Hellgate for 16 years.
In terms of Michael Powell and Emma Pressburger films, there's no doubt that I don't know where I could tell you that it's very specific where the influence is in this particular film. But I think the theater scene with the assassination attempt, the stovepipe hats in that scene, particularly of 400 men in the orchestra with stovepipe hats on, the nature of what everybody looks like on the stage, the set of Satan's Circus, the look in Bill's place, the nature of Bill the Butcher's villainy. It's gotten to the point where I think so much has been digested by me of their work that I don't think it's something where it's very specific. I can say this shot or that shot. I guess really what you could say is the level of theatricality is something I think that comes from being enamored of their work and therefore being strengthened by it to go ahead and try something on that level. As, for example, the performance of Bill the Butcher, going all the way back for me to some of the more outrageous performances in the Powell Pressburger pictures. The movement of the ballet dancers in Red Shoes, and particularly Tales of Hoffman, Robert Helpman, Leonid Massine. Look at Red Shoes when Leonid Massine quits. Watch as he's walking along with Anton Walbrook. There's a spotlight, and he's practicing in the spotlight, but he has to tell Boris that he's quitting. And spotlight moves away from him, and he says, "The spotlight always on me, toujours sur moi." They put it back on him, even though he's just talking in a personal conversation. And look at the nature of the way they move, the body language of Anton Walbrook and Leonid Massine in that picture, for example, in that one scene alone. So it's always sort of stuck in my head. I mean, I don't know anything about ballet. I don't really work with ballet dancers, or any dancers really, but there's something about the way Bill walks, his spindly legs like a spider, and the nature of his enjoyment of his own theatricality, and even Amsterdam's enjoyment of it too. The sense of Amsterdam's somewhat debauched life as he's living with Bill, his degeneration to a certain extent, particularly when he gets up and when he realizes Jenny is something more to Bill than just an acquaintance, and he toasts Bill. I love the way he stands in that frame, and the look on his face, and his sense of weaving back and forth. It's almost like a fever dream. He doesn't know where he is at that point, but he knows his feelings. And so that all comes out of the Powell Pressburger work.
That night, the reformers held a dance. That was the 5 points, all right. Hangings of a morning, dancings of an evening. Sure myself, but it's not a matter of words. I can tell by the way she smiles. Sir. Well, she smiles at a lot of people, John.
Sir.
You don't know her.
A penny of gratitude for fighting Irishmen young, sir.
You from Kerry?
I am, sir. I am.
Well, I think it's hard for people to understand now, but as soon as they got off the boat, there was no place for them to go. They couldn't really generate a salary in a way. They had to go find work, and I think it seemed natural to go into the cheapest area of New York, and that was the 5 Points, and it was considered the world's worst slum. And there was a place in the 5 Points that became very famous called the Old Brewery. I think it was an 18th century brewery, and it was kind of ramshackle by the time of the turn of the century, the 19th century. And basically, it became a place where people just went in and lived, squatters in a sense. And but it was such a warren. Apparently, nobody really knows what it looked like inside, but apparently it was such a warren of rooms and caves and underground passages, and the romantic image that comes out of it is one of like a strange kind of subterranean existence where people would just find a way to find a little corner in there and live as best they could. And many were afraid to come out because of gangs of nativists who would be roving around trying to beat up the latest immigrants who came in. But the place also became famous for its the names it gave different areas of the old brewery, the Murderer's Alley, Brickbat Mansion, and places like that, names like that, I should say. But in any event, it was really, I guess, something that's quite unimaginable. And it seemed to me that everybody was living inside the brewery, which was also maybe 3 or 4 stories high, but also had an underground. And because when they went into to actually kind of renovate, or actually, I think, gutted the place. I'm not quite sure exactly what they did, but when they made the mission in the 1850s of the old brewery, they discovered graves under there. They discovered bodies and all sorts of things, apparently, according to historians at the time. But you have to understand the historians of the period. I mean, a place like this could be exaggerating to a certain extent. One doesn't know really what happens in an area like that. You don't know who's winning, which gang is winning, and what are they winning, ultimately, when they fight. Serious news papers didn't really deal with that area very much. It was kind of cut off and forgotten about. It became known as the greatest slum in the world. Charles Dickens visited the slum when he came to America. In his book American Notes, 1851 or 1852, he describes going to the 5 Points and saying it was worse than anything in London, worse than the East End. If you read Oliver Twist or, Great Expectations, you get a sense of what he must have boggled the mind. Davy Crockett visited the place. He found it extremely unnerving. He preferred the woods, he said. It was really dangerous. And, of course, Abraham Lincoln went there the first day or two that he was here to give the speech at Cooper Union. And by that time, the old brewery had become a mission. And that became the sense of, a kind of a sense of, how should I put it, a reforming of the place. But it was almost impossible to reform. It had to take waves of, a cycle had to be lived through in a way, ultimately until after the Civil War. And I think what ultimately did it, is that Jacob Riis started taking photographs in the 1870s. And a lot of attention was brought down to that area, and not just the 5 Points, but that whole Lower East Side, and the condition of the nature of what the poor in America is really like, particularly at that time. And but prior to 1860, I think that place could be, you can imagine anything, I would think, and you'd be almost halfway accurate. Well, I think what's important to understand, the know-nothings, the wide-awakes, and generally what we call the Native American, not the Native American of the Indians. These were the Europeans who settled, who fought the British, pretty much. Not everybody agreed on that revolution. There were some people, there were families divided, there were cities divided. It was quite a miracle that we made it through in terms of as a continental army. It almost didn't exist. So it's a miracle that we came out of that with our independence. Many of the people who, the next generation of those who fought in the Revolution and those original colonists, felt that America was now achieved. It was individual freedom, was separation of church and state, and there were battles as to within the cabinet and within in the country in terms of what kind of a country it still should be. I mean, basically making the country work, making the democracy work. There was obviously different ideas of what the country should be and what government should be. Jeffersonian, Alexander Hamilton, all the different ideas. And so we find that I don't believe that many of the founding fathers or founding brothers had in mind such extraordinary waves of immigration coming into America. I don't think they understood that. They never had that really, I don't think they could see that far into the future. And so when it happened, you're in a way, I'm not generalizing, but when it happened, you had a situation where a lot of people were suddenly shocked by this and said, this isn't what the country's supposed to be. These are foreign invaders. In fact, we have a flag, an American flag in the film that has writing on it that says, Native Americans, beware of foreign invaders. And that's a flag of the period. Beware of foreign invaders, because they will destroy our system, and we paid for it with our blood for this system. And one understands, too, you fight and you struggle just to get in a boat to get over here is a major achievement. And then to get here and to fight to get the land, and then to work on a society, and then fight a revolution. And then, I mean, one of the key things about America, of course, is the fact that it wants to be so different. It was meant to be so different from everything they were escaping in Europe. Religious wars, unfair monarchy, that sort of thing. So that one can understand the pressure when what they fought for in their minds was going to be compromised or changed by bringing in the things they ran away from, the things they rejected. And there were many who were not open-minded about that, and so they called themselves Native Americans, Anglo-Dutch stock mainly, whose families had fought in the Revolution and everything else, and they created this country. And why should let anybody else in? They had the slaves at that point, a lot of the freed slaves coming up from the South, and then all of a sudden these waves of Irish were coming in. The extraordinary number of them coming in weekly from the 1840s to the 1870s. The fact that they were very poor, escaping a famine in Ireland at the time. And they weren't being helped in Ireland, by the way. 1 million died, I believe. Some were reduced to cannibalism, but the countries around them didn't help. England didn't help. I understand that there were some shipments of wheat from America along with the British had worked that out, but it was far too late, too little too late. And so many of them, rather than starving and being reduced to nothing, took a boat and came to America. And they got off in New York. And some went out to the Midwest, but the majority of them were so dirt poor that they had to stay in New York. And there's no place, the only place that could envelop the poor was an area called the Five Points, and further areas that were just not even called anything, shanty towns, basically. And the city was still being built in a way. And nobody really had what the city should look in mind. And nobody really had in mind what the city should ultimately look like either. They still don't. So there's no urban planning. So people still doing it. The city is still making itself. It's never finished. It's like ancient Rome. I think one of the great ancient writers said Rome would be a wonderful place when they finish building it. Same thing with New York. So none of the nativists figured this would happen. Not only that, they were poor, they had no skills, didn't speak English for the most part, spoke Gaelic, and they were Catholic. And even though this is a country that says that basically claims that there's religious freedom, it still was a struggle. It still was a struggle for Catholics and for ultimately other religions. And it's a struggle today for other religions, as we know. And mainly because people feel that they're going to threaten our way of life. And this is a real question, even more alive today than it was in the 1840s and 1850s. And so what they mean by threatening the way of life is that they listen to a foreign power. At the time, the Vatican was a very strong foreign power. It still is to a certain extent today, but even stronger then, we think, as I recall from what I've read. And how does that work, you say? Well, they can vote in America. Well, they're not educated. Well, the church has representatives here in America. They're the archbishops. Well, what does that mean? Well, the archbishop will then tell the uneducated masses of Irish how to vote. That means the Vatican will influence American elections, and we'll lose our freedom. That's ultimately what it's about.
Right there, Mr. Cutting. Americans are borning.
I don't see no Americans. I see trespassers. Irish hops do a job for a nickel what a nigger does for a dime, and a white man used to get a quarter.
That first great influx of immigration from Ireland was the first great test of what America's supposed to be. This bring us your homeless and your poverty-stricken and those who are oppressed, etc., come to our country and, become a citizen and work with us. And but there were so many, so fast, and for such a prolonged period of time that it created that who has the right to be here situation, which is something that we deal with every day, I think, in America.
My father gave his life making this country what it is. Murdered by the British with all of his men on the 25th of July, Anno Domini 1814. You think I'm gonna help you befoul his legacy? By giving this country over to them was had no hand in the fighting for it? Why, because they come off a boat crawling with lice and begging you for soup?
You're a great one for the fighting, Bill, I know. But you can't fight forever.
I can go down doing it.
And you will.
We condensed, in a sense, dramatically condensed visually, what it could have been like for an Irishman to come over to New York, to suddenly find himself not be able to get a job, to see a very attractive offer from the army, which give you 3 meals a day and that sort of thing, and suddenly find himself with a gun and getting on a boat and then, unfortunately, being killed in the very next battle. Having to become a citizen in between that, by the way. In a sense, of course, that's a condensation of what must have really occurred. But in a way, we think it might as well have been that way. We don't say it was, but it might as well have been that way. That's simple. Citizen, soldier, go get your gun. Here's your gun. Don't let it get dry. Here's your uniform. Get on the boat. Oh, by the way, be careful when you get on the boat. There are coffins of other soldiers coming off. And in a sense, we did it to have that dramatic impact. Because in reality, it could have taken several weeks or certainly days before they could have gone through the process of being a citizen to a soldier, but and certainly getting killed. And we don't say all the Irish immigrants got killed, became soldiers either. But, it was not a bad deal, 3 meals a day. And I don't mean that ironically either. I mean, they couldn't get jobs. What were they going to do? You have a chance, you stay alive. Nobody understood what war is. They don't really have pictures. We don't see. They were just beginning to get black and white photographs being made by Matthew Brady and his school of photographers down the Civil War.
What happens at the finish then? Then we have ourselves a rowdy down. Ain't you never been to the theater before?
Nah. Mr. Legree, lay down your whip.
Was one of the aspects of life in the underworld of the city that I wanted to show was what theater events would be like. In those days, it was common for different factions to show up at the theater and react violently to what was going on the stage, to make a demonstration, so to speak. And you often had different factions fighting it out right on the stage and in the theater. And of course, it's sort of a reference to there's a famous theater riot called the Astor Place Theater Riot, 1859, if I'm not mistaken, in which 21 innocent people were killed outside, which had to do with a British actor doing Shakespeare or an American actor. And the working classes and the poorer Americans in New York preferred the American actor. The upper classes wanted the British actor, and the British actor appeared, and there was a riot, and it was outside an Astor Place, and for some reason, it was the army out there, and they opened fire, and 21 innocent people had nothing to do with the theater, and just walking in the streets were killed in Astor Place. Women and children, too. In many books I read about that riot, and in some they point out the Astor Place riot was your average theater riot at first, until it turned ugly outside, which meant that if historians today are referring to it as their average theater riot, that means that the theater apparently was a place where you just didn't go and sit down and be quiet and have a good night and go out for dinner and and sit and enjoy a wonderful play. No, it was a place for demonstrations. If the plays represented certain political points of view and political positions, and if people disagree with that, they were first not only throwing fruit and rotten vegetables, but then maybe getting on the stage. There's several paintings, everybody standing on stage in the 1820s all the way up to the turn of the century, 1900s. The other thing is that we thought it would be interesting to put on a very well-meaning play, Uncle Tom's Cabin, at the 5 Points Mission, knowing full well the nativist groups would be totally against it. Then when you see the stage production itself, it was pretty common for white people to play blacks in blackface. In fact, the great American performer of the time was a man named Dan Rice. He was amazing, apparently. Several books have been written on him now at the moment, and he was amazing in terms of his improvisatory ability. One of the reviews I read of one of the books compared him, let's say, to a Robin Williams of that time, who was able to just talk and move and improvise into any character, However, he also created the character of Jim Crow. So you see where this is going. It's just simply, which then became the minstrel shows. In a sense, I may be oversimplifying it, but that was a common. Slavery was still in existence, and that was a common device that was used on the stage. The addition of Abraham Lincoln was something that Jay Cox had put in to make direct reference to the war, and the idea of literally trying to heal both sides of the nation, but having the poor man hang there like a god coming from heaven was Jay's idea, which I thought was interesting because he would be sort of stuck up there, Lincoln, as an icon, at the mercy of those who disliked him. And there were a lot of people who disliked him at the time, as you know.
Intermission is over!
was bloody Shakespearean.
What?
Do you know who Shakespeare was, Sonny? He was a fellow who wrote the King James Bible.
I don't know what in the hell you're talking about.
Because you're a thick, ignorant, barbarous Irish whelp. Just like your father.
In the process of the making of the film, the evolution of the film, we determined how much the prominence of the personal story against the backdrop of the history. We determined the different formula each time in different drafts of the script, while I was shooting the picture, while I was editing many different times. And it finally only came down to ultimately the last 2 months of editing, where I finally feel I got it at the right level, the right proportions. But I do think that the foreground story of fictional characters, the characters represent groups of people. And I think we could be safe in assuming that ultimately what the character of Amsterdam, Leo DiCaprio, represents is ultimately the next generation of the Irish immigrant, the next generation who will begin to assimilate, who will be accepted by the society, as opposed to the first generations who came here in the 1840s and 1850s that had a very difficult time assimilating. Not that he was going to have an easier time, but he was going to be part of the new city, of the new government, so to speak. And up against this backdrop, up against this struggle for ultimately what will become assimilation, is the Civil War, in which the whole country is redefining itself in the first place. But in any event, in determining fictional characters, we try to take a character that represents certain currents of that period, represents certain movements, have certain beliefs. In the case of Amsterdam, he's kind of rooted in a tribal struggle, which when law and order, or as I should say, a more civilization breaks down, we tend to break down into ultimately tribes and everything that takes with it. Everything that takes with it, ritual, religion becomes something that you fight with, not for. It becomes the cross becomes a sword, and from that, I'm very interested in how society breaks down, and when it builds up again, what form does it take first? Family unit, to tribe, to groups of people, political parties, etc. Ultimately, but Amsterdam represents the cross between that, from the ancient to the new, to a certain extent. But in order to become the new, he has to fight through the ancient. He has to go through the old blood rituals of the ancient and live that out. He's also in the foreground of the story, fighting ultimately to become a young man, which means he's got to fight the image he has of his own father, which is partially Liam Neeson, but mainly Daniel Day-Lewis's character in the film, and ultimately becoming a citizen of the new city. The dramatic device that drives the narrative is one of revenge. The young boy comes back from the House of Reform, sent away for 15 years. Not a reform school, but a House of Reform, which is a place where they really treated kids pretty tough in a way, kids who had no parents and that sort of thing. And loses some of his original Irish accent in the process, because accents were affected in New York. They spoke many different accents, they had many different languages. And basically wants to get revenge on Bill the Butcher for killing his father in an earlier gang war in 1846. It's very tribal, very primitive, but that revenge drives him and drives the story. However, to take revenge in a case like that, one has to make sure that people know you're taking revenge. They have to see it. They have to know it. They have to understand. It's got to be ritualized. It's got to be symbolic almost. And you've got to do it where everybody can see you. So therefore, I figured the story should be about a young boy who has to insinuate himself and earn Bill's trust before he takes him, and makes a show of it in killing Bill the Butcher, for everything Bill the Butcher represented too. I don't know if Amsterdam is as open-minded, or not as open-minded, but I don't know if Amsterdam at the beginning of the story is as cognizant of the struggle of the Irish immigrant, is cognizant of what he could be capable of. Ultimately, he develops that, and he discovers that halfway or 2/3 into the picture, how he could change and actually not only just silence one of the Native Americans, but silence the whole group in a way, and assimilate, allow for assimilation, and that is to ultimately unify the Irish American in New York. He sort of symbolizes a whole group of people that were doing that at the time, along with the help of the church, to the Catholic Church. But in terms of finding revenge, getting the revenge on Bill the Butcher, he has to gain the Butcher's trust, but also what also comes into play, he didn't count on one thing, and that is his need, his heart. He didn't count on
the feelings he'd have for Jenny Everdeen, whom he met earlier in the picture. I think Jenny is a character. It's interesting to me because ultimately she does represent something that, in a way, part of his digression is Jenny. Part of his realization of his feelings, of his human feelings, his emotion, his feelings of love, his feelings of nurturing almost come because of meeting Jenny. He fights against it at first. And that, of course, is complicated by her relationship with Bill, which makes it even more upsetting for him. But he gets passionate about her and passionate about Bill. It's almost as if it's true that he's suffered this loss of a father figure, and Bill is so charismatic, the man he's going to kill, that Bill ultimately, after a while, takes the place of that father. And then Amsterdam is faced with the reality that he has to kill him, because his father's ghost, the blood father, in his mind has told him that this is what has to be done, according to tribal custom. And he's got to readjust himself to kill this man whom he's finding himself attracted to, in a way, as a father, in a way. A man who needs, a son who needs a father, and a father who needs a son. That's why I think he hasn't really thought beyond killing Bill. That's why he finds himself in conflict when he has these feelings for Jenny and these feelings for Bill. After the confrontation, he has to find another way of doing them in. And he's got a big conflict, really, after that first confrontation between Bill and him in the big pagoda, Sparrow's Chinese pagoda, midway through the film. Afterwards, he's got to sort of rebuild himself, be reborn, and rethink everything, and ultimately finds a way within the American system, which is politics. But then, of course, that is cut short, too. And he's forced back into a kind of primal state. And then, as they're working it out, the world changes that situation for them. Makes them almost antique in a way. How should you say? Makes them obsolete, ultimately. And those ways obsolete. Bill the Butcher, on the other hand, complicate matters. When he killed Amsterdam's father in the early battle scene, we find that there's a hatred for the enemy between the two, between Bill the Butcher and Priest Vallon, Amsterdam's father. But there's also an extraordinary respect between the two men, sort of respect the two gladiators would have for each other. Great fighters, men of honor. I disagree totally with what you believe, but I respect your right to believe it. I'm going to fight you for it. I'm going to kill you for it. But I admire your conviction. I also admire your style. And so Bill the Butcher has this extraordinary affection for the man he killed.
I killed the last honorable man 15 years ago. Since then, you've seen his porch from downstairs?
Mm-hmm.
Is your mouth all glued up with coney juice? I asked you a question.
I said I seen it, sir.
Oh, you got a murderous rage in you, and I like it. Oh, it's life boiling up inside of you. It's good. The priest and me, we lived by the same principles. It was only faith divided us. He gave me this, That was the finest beating I ever took. My face was pulp. My guts was pierced. My ribs was all mashed up. When he came to finish me, I couldn't look him in the eye. He spared me because he wanted me to live in shame. This was a great man. Great man. So I cut out the eye that looked away. Sent it to him wrapped in blue paper. I would have cut them both out if I could have fought him blind. And I rose back up again with a full heart and buried him in his own blood.
Well done.
He was the only man I ever killed worth remembering. I never had a son. Civilization is crumbling. God bless you.
I kept asking everybody, all of my collaborators, to go for the most. In other words, to give me the most history, anthropology, story, action, all the time, in every scene as much as possible. And that was the tension in making the picture, and also in the production itself. Naturally, this costs money, you know, and after a certain point, one has to deal with the fact of how much money you have left, or none at all. So, and then when you really get down to it, you have to decide what's really important. Jay Cox is an old friend of mine from 1968, and when he was a Time magazine film reviewer. And over the years, he did several drafts of the script, and then ultimately in 1999 did a few more. But ultimately, Steve Zalian was called in. Steve and Zalian and I had worked together on other projects, and he said he'd be on for a couple of months or 6 weeks or so, but he stayed about 6 months, working with me on recreating structure, restructuring, I should say, trying to balance the history with the personal story, and that sort of thing. And ultimately, he had to go and work on his own film, and Kenny Lonergan was flying to Rome on his honeymoon, and so we said, come and visit us, we wanted to talk to him. So we sort of said, why don't you just stay here for just a few days and play around with some ideas we have. And then, of course, that's what happened. He stayed for a few months, and back and forth flying to New York and working together on fax machines, on telephones, and that sort of thing. But ultimately with Kenny, we did more character work, particularly on Amsterdam and Jenny. That was the key thing. And that happened, I think, 4 weeks before shooting started. In the middle of this, a couple of times, was a wonderful writer named Hossein Amini, and he was brought in by Harvey to help me out in certain periods where we were moving between the major writers. And he worked for me in December of '99 for a few weeks. But his main endeavor at the time was working on Four Feathers, so it was very hard for him to follow through. Bill the Butcher's accent. Once again, we wanted to play with certain aspects of what we know to be historical fact and what could have been possible at that time and what existed at that time. Because as today, New York back then is very much a multilingual city. You could hear anything in New York today. You stand on a street corner, you hear Pakistan, Jamaica, any place from Asia, and it goes on and on with in the original language plus accented. when they're speaking English. So that at that time, this was a similar case. And for Bill the Butcher's accent, we had to create it. Tim Monach and Daniel Day-Lewis had to create it. And they had two examples. One example was there is a wax cylinder of Walt Whitman reciting 4 lines from one of his poems about New York that exists. And they listened to it, and Walt Whitman used the phrase ample streets, the ample streets of New York. And when he said ample, he said, instead of saying ample the way we normally would say it now, his accent was ample, the ample streets. Now, that's one thing. The other thing was that Louis Auchincloss told me, after I had finished Age of Innocence, that Mrs. Jones, whom Mrs. Mingott is based upon in the film, in reality, Mrs. Jones' accent was much more interesting, he said. For example, she would say things like, don't forget to take your poils, goils. So now you have ample, poils, and goils. And it begins to sound like a New York East Side or a 1940s or 1930s taxi driver, a real New York dead-end kid's accent. And that's what we based it upon. Also, we found there are many plays that are still in existence in print that were performed in the Bowery, about the Bowery Boys, which was a nativist gang, mainly. That's why they don't feature very, very strongly in this picture. But it's all written out. All the slang is written out and how they spoke. We see the way the words are written. Boyos is Bhoys. The names and the names of the people, and of course the jargon, or I should say they really had their own language. It was called the Rogues. It was written up in 1859 by an ex-police chief into a collection called the Rogues Lexicon, and we use a lot of those words in the film. And in some cases we could have done more, but it was almost you would have to have subtitles. And so Daniel worked with Tim Monach on that basis of getting that 1940s and 1930s New York accent, which would develop, I think, from the upper classes down to the working classes. Toity and Toyd instead of 33rd Street and 3rd, Poils for Goyles, that sort of thing. So it's almost something it's not heard. It's certainly not heard anymore. But that's how he developed it, and then read aloud passages from the Bible constantly, and Tim would perfect it. So they created it themselves, based on these points. Also, New York at that time, Leo DiCaprio's accent is less Irish than some of the other characters, mainly because for 15 years he was in a house of reform, in which he was around other people, not Irish necessarily, who Dutch and German and that sort of thing, English, who would, in which case his accent would be corrupted. Henry Thomas's accent is a little more Irish. He stayed in the 5 points. Cameron Diaz's accent wouldn't be as Irish either because she was raised by the nativists, so it would be corrupted also. Shang, played by Stephen Graham, he comes from Liverpool. You have a variety of accents all that time, very, very much the way New York was now, and that's the way we worked it out. When we had to discuss when we had to decide on an Irish accent, we I think decided on a country accent rather than Dublin, because it's less melodic.
William Tell!
The butterfly!
The tomahawk!
Spider's kiss!
The butcher's apprentice!
Oh, the butcher's apprentice.
Command performance!
A command performance indeed! And for this, I must beg the indulgence of my former assistant in matters of impalement, the butcher's original apprentice. What do you say, Jen? One more time for the sweet souvenir. Come on.
girl, Jenny. Don't be afraid. What a woman.
Good evening, Bill.
Remember this?
Of course.
You may feel more comfortable without that garment, Miss Everdeen.
You'll have to filch me a new one, Bill.
Anything in your pockets tonight?
Oh, I ain't started working yet.
What about that locket that I gave you? Apologies, my dear. Pick it up. Whoopsie daisy! Now it's good and broke. I can't seem to get anything right tonight. You got the sand to give them a grand finale?
Maybe when you're aiming a little straighter.
Enough of this heathen music! Get rid of these goddamn monkeys! Strike up, boys! This is a night for Americans!
And I think throughout the entire film, the biggest problem was to balance the historical accuracy, when we wanted to, with the dream effect of the picture, a kind of heightened reality, a kind of surreality in a way. When Bill throws the knives at Jenny, and Amsterdam makes the first attempt to try to kill Bill. And ultimately, when he throws that knife at the pagoda, at Bill, he loses out. He's pummeled almost to death, and basically at a moment that seems, how should I put it? Basically, the scene is shot at first realistically, but then as the people are shouting out different names of different titles to the knife act, to the what they call acts of impalement, ultimately Bill's speech about what should I take from him, what should I cut, the loin, the ribs, and somebody yells the heart. And then he says, this boy has no heart. And then someone yells, kill him. It's almost like a nightmare. It's not quite real anymore. In fact, that pagoda was based on a set that was designed by Boris Levin, whom I had the honor of working with a number of times on New York, New York, Last Waltz, King of Comedy, Color of Money, and he even started in the first attempt at Last Temptation of Christ, actually. And Boris was a great production designer who designed Giant by George Stevens and West Side Story, Robert Wise Jerome Robbins film. And of course, he started in the 30s, and he had something to do with the design of a wonderful set in a film directed by Joseph von Sternberg, which I think is his best film without Marlene Dietrich, called The Shanghai Gesture. And I think it was 1940s, early 40s, with Gene Tierney and Victor Mature, and takes place in Shanghai, and it's quite unique. And again, a very sense of heightened reality, where you're in a place, Madame Jin Sling's place in Shanghai, where anything could happen. And that's the way I wanted to, that's the 5 points I wanted to create too, which was a place that anything could happen. Real, surreal, imagined, not imagined. Because no one really knows. No one really knows what that place was really like. I think what would be a modern equivalent, I really don't. And probably Don DeLillo's Underworld in that novel. There's several sections towards the end which describe an inner city nightmare of a place to live in, and whatever we can imagine. Believe me, doing the research over these many years, it was much worse, And so that was designed that way, based on the set that Boris Levin had designed in Shanghai Gesture, to heighten the reality of the picture and to bring it into a fever dream. Really, is what we wanted to achieve. This is really the balancing between history and historical accuracy and imagination. They claim that many Chinese, they claim that there weren't that many Chinese in New York at the time in the 1860s, particularly late 1850s, early 1860s. They claim it was later. Based on what? Well, one of the technical advisors told me that, the first registered Chinese person was 1870 or something. And so how did you know that? And so, they opened up a cigar shop on Canal Street. I said, but that's the first registered one. We have no idea. Certainly, so we took that idea and we said, what if there were more Chinese there? And I took that also from reading some of Herman Melville books, like books about his voyages of Redburn and Whitejacket and things like that, describing the New York waterfront, where, believe me, there were many types of people there at that time, not recorded. When they died, who knows where they buried them. Potter's Field didn't come into existence until later. In any event, it's pulling the film together was a combination of how much historical accuracy I really wanted to deal with and how much of an opera do we want to create. Historians, we went through many different people. We've got many opinions on the script. Some understood right away, like Peter Quinn, writer, who understood that he said it's an impression of a time. It's not a documentary, and to let everybody know that. And in a sense, it's the truth wrapped up in lies, or what they call faction, a mixture of fact and fiction, and enjoyed the audacity of the script. He liked that. Others were more literal about certain things, as pointing out that the first Chinese in New York was in 1870, let's say. I don't know the exact date, because it had been registered as cigar stores. Well, that, believe me, anything could be down that downtown area. Nobody really recorded that area down there. It was just something that they hoped would go away. But in any event, Luc Sant, who wrote the definitive book on the underworld in America up to 1920s and 30s, I believe, called Lowlife, in which he includes Gangs of New York by Herbert Asbury, which is the book that inspired the title of this film, and many other sources of books of that kind from the 19th century that were even more sensationalistic, quite honestly, and more dealing with the mythology of New York in a way, when New York was up for grabs, so to speak. And the draft riots were considered an insurrection as serious, which they were. It was the greatest riots in American history, as serious as the Commune in France in the 1840s. This was it. The draft riots determined the last vestige of major insurrection, so to speak, in the city of New York. And after that, it became a city after the Civil War. Literally 2 years later, it became a city. In 1865, the police force was worked out. They didn't have rival police forces like municipal and metropolitan police fighting it out all the time. They instituted a fire department. They insisted that horses pull the wagons, because men pulled the wagons up to that point. It was more macho to do that. And it was literally creating a fire department was an important thing, because up to that point there were different fire brigades. It were more like fire gangs in a way. And in any event, Luc Sant was the man to deal with all of this. And give you an example of, we would call Luc all the time to ask him, on a scene like this, what would be happening in the street? Now, I know I have a list of things over the years for so many things, but could I have that? Could we move this? And well, that would be more like, and he would give us details, and I would work on the details I wanted, and I ask him if it's valid or not. And then if it wasn't invalid, could we take license with that particular moment? And very often we were able to. But for example, Satan's Circus, which is the name of a club or a saloon in the 1880s, I believe, but we moved it up in time for Bill's because it's such a wonderful name. And my production designers were talking about printing the name on the window or something. No, it's too settled, established. Now this whole place was primitive, and so I asked Luke, and Luke said, well, maybe, he said, very often they maybe would have pretty much like the Middle Ages, where a lot of people weren't able to read, so a bakery would have a picture of a piece of bread. You see, so you know that's where you go for bread. So here, he said, maybe a puppet of some sort, or a little, and I thought of a puppet of Mephistopheles, a little devil puppet, and we based it on the puppet used in Edgar G. Ulmer's film Bluebeard. They did performances of Faust with puppets in that film. There was also in the DVD some color footage taken in the 1940s of that film, and I saw that I saw the actual colors of the puppet, the reds and the blacks, and so I showed it to Dante, and they made up that for me. And then he said they probably would carve the name in the woods. That's what we did. That kind of detail will give you an idea, along with the historical facts of how we pulled it together.
I often wondered if he'd lived a bit longer. Would he have wanted a bit more?
Why'd you rifle through his pockets then?
For safekeeping. Thought maybe you could do with it.
Blood stays on the blade.
About 20 some odd years ago, I think it was an Alan Lomax documentary I saw on PBS. I saw what appeared to be 3 or 4 men, African Americans. Some had drums around their necks. They were playing these drums, and one guy was playing a fife, reed pipe, and I never heard anything quite like it. And I believe I got an audio tape of it, and over the years I played it, and I always said that's the kind of music, if ever I did Gangs in New York, that's what it would be. And I found some when I started doing the work on the script and designing the shots, and it was given to me. It turned out to be music by Othar Turner and the Rising Sun Band, a fife and drum band in the hills. It's from the hills of Mississippi, not the Delta. This music, and they would have a big party and kill a goat and eat the goat. And the CD's called "Everybody's Hollering Goat," and the song is called "Wobble She Wobble," and that's the music that I designed most of the film to. That particular piece, it's very often mistaken for Celtic music, because people say it's interesting Celtic music at the beginning. Well, no, it's North Mississippi, the hills. It's Othar Turner, who just passed away at 94 2 weeks ago, and his daughter, 45 years old, same day. They're featured in the blues documentary I'm directing. That's part of a blues series that we're doing for PBS. 7 directors doing their impressions of the blues, and they were able to get Othar Turner and interview him. Corey Harris, a modern blues musician, went down to Mississippi, and we just edited another sequence of his yesterday, of Othar. So he was put on film at least, and we got him. Interesting music, because it comes from the fife and drum that was used by the American Revolutionary Forces to signal to different groups, different battle formations, to regroup during a battle. And so they took that fife and drum that is almost that you see, I would think almost that you see in the famous picture of that's used to represent the country, little drummer boy, a man playing a fife, and another man holding a flag, I think, walking along, they're wounded. That's the music. And but the Africans took it in North Mississippi, became something else. And it stayed that way. And Othar Turner's daughter died. Unfortunately, she's in the film too, the blues documentary. She was 45. But his granddaughter has been taught how to continue with the fife. And so the tradition will continue, hopefully. but that music was very important to me. Originally, in 1979, I liked I had a different kind of the film. The film had many transformations, and I guess as many as I had as a person, really. And it reflects, certainly it would have been a different film in 1979 or 80 than it was now. It would be different if I'm alive 10 years from now, if I did it 10 years from now. There's no doubt about it. My interests happen to shift. But at that time, the music that drove the picture, besides the Othar Turner, and going along with the type of, continuing the tradition, continuing the nature of the type of soundtracks I create in my movies, Mean Streets with Mean Streets and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore and Raging Bull and Goodfellas and Casino. It's recorded music of the period in which they're in. And so I wanted to do something somewhat different in the late 70s and to take the music of the Clash and you have them write music for the film and keep that driving beat, almost like a punk rock feeling to the piece, the Ramones, the Clash, but mainly the Clash, I was thinking, and that they would write music for this, and we got together many times, we talked about it. And it was almost in 1981, there was almost a possibility of getting the film made with Arne Milchan, who had just produced King of Comedy, and with us. But again, the whole industry had changed, and it was too much money for that kind of film. And everything had to be rethought, really. But that was the drive there. Maybe the film would have been more graphically violent in the late 70s than it is now. But in any event, while I was designing the picture, the Clash music still helped.
Are you too young to remember your old Uncle Jack?
Ah, the times we had.
You know I won't hurt you.
The first time I worked with Michael Ballhaus was After Hours, 1984-85. He rejuvenated me in terms of working as a director. Prior to that, a lot of the films I had made, two of the films, or three, New York, New York, Raging Bull, and King of Comedy, took about 100 and some odd days to shoot each. And the case of After Hours was 40 nights, and 16, 17, 20 setups a night, which was really good for me, rejuvenated me, and has been a major collaborator on most of my pictures since then. We have a shorthand. I design shots in note form or even in little drawings. He then transfers those drawings and directions into his own book, writes them in German, and then memorizes it, and works that way with me. And if we have difficulty, if we have to lose, out of 10 setups, we have to lose 6, we'll come together and see which are the most important ones to keep, and that sort of thing. So he's very, very, he knows how I work, knows my temperament, and I know his, and he's always a relaxing force on the set, so to speak. He's always calm, which is good. Joe Reedy is also that way too, and I worked with him since Color of Money, 1985, and knows the type of actors I work with, knows the kind of background action I usually like, and knows what'll work for me and what won't. I mean, I know it's generalizing it, but he's pretty much sort of a right hand of the operation in a way.
Get all of us together and we ain't got a gang. We got an army. And all you need's a spark, right? Just one spark. Something to wake us all up.
As I grew older, I became more interested in history. I realized that our history only went back a couple hundred years. And in Europe and Asia, the history goes back thousands. And so everything that was of the old world in New York, I found fascinating. And only recently, in the past 20 years or so, 15 years, there's been movements for city landmarks to be preserved. And it's a pity that so many of the other ones were taken down, the 50s and 60s. But I must say, I grew up in the Lower East Side, and this is one of the reasons I got so fascinated by this story. The old Irish neighborhood, Elizabeth Street and Mott Street and Mulberry. And I remember the streets, cobblestone streets, and I remember the streets breaking off into just dust and dirt, into yards and little ramshackle houses that may come from the late 18th century, and all these strange things about the old New York that was sort of seeping right out of the ground at the time when I was growing up. And I knew that St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, which was on on Prince Street between Mott and Mulberry was, let me put it this way, my neighborhood at that time was Italian, but I knew that St. Patrick was not a national Italian saint, an Irish saint. So, and also the school I was going to, the elementary school, the Sisters of Charity, the nuns were Irish, and it was kind of odd. As 8 years old, I was wondering why there was that different group. But as I got older, I began to understand and began to realize that this was a neighborhood in flux all the time, staying the same in a way, only with the different ethnic groups coming in. And the St. Patrick's Old Cathedral was the first Catholic cathedral in New York. And it's exactly the way it was at that time. It's surrounded by a big red brick wall. And I shot some of Mean Streets outside there, and which I also had shown to Dean Tovillaris, who was the great production designer of The Godfather, when he was doing location scouting for Godfather 1. I showed him that church, and I showed him the interior of the church, the cathedral. And they chose the interior for the sequence where Al Pacino is baptizing the child at the end of Godfather 1. And not the exterior, but the interior. And but in any event, that was the place, and in a sense, all the Irish migrated there. And I heard all these stories, and the first story I heard about this period was about that cathedral. I was told by somebody down there, I forget, maybe one of the priests, that at one point in time, that church, which was the cathedral, which was the first Catholic cathedral in New York, I think it was built 1810, 1812, was about to be attacked by the Know-Nothings, who felt that nobody else should come into America. Their family fought for it. It's their land, and nobody else comes in, especially people who owe their allegiance to a foreign power. And the Irish was the first great wave of immigration into America, and they owed their allegiance to the Vatican, they felt. Nativists felt, because they're Catholic. And so the nativists threatened to attack the church. And when they came down Prince Street, as they got closer to the cathedral, they saw the church surrounded by not only the Irish men, but women and children, the whole community. And I did some research into it. I really wasn't doing, I didn't know I was doing research, but I went to public library and when I was in high school and did term papers on the church and the history of the church, and began to understand figures like Archbishop Hughes and others who were so important at the time. And I realized that this event was, it actually took place, I think, in 1844. And the group of anti-Catholics, much more than anti-Catholic, they're very staunch chauvinists in a way about American. They were warned by Archbishop Hughes, who said, if you touch one Catholic church in New York, New York will be turned into another Moscow. And he was referring to what the Russians did to Moscow. So when Napoleon came into Moscow, it was already burned down. There was nothing to take.
What's a dead rabbit doing with the natives? Huh? There's no niggers among the natives. Natives and rabbits is one thing.
And so the nativists stopped. They stopped and walked back up to Prince Street to the Bowery and went away. And that was the beginning of the, not only the conflict, but the ultimate assimilation, really, and the ultimate settling of everything. But that was early. It was 1844, 1845. And by the time things settled in for the Irish immigrants, it could be the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So it took a long time. And in a way, they were the vanguard of every other immigrant group that's come into America and that continues to come in. They've suffered for them. They've struggled for them. And so they're great formation. They're such an extraordinary role in the formation of this country. In the 19th century, a number of historians have been telling us throughout the making of the film that if democracy didn't work in New York in the 19th century, it wasn't going to work in the rest of the country. Primarily, I still think to a certain amount now, too. Everybody comes into New York, usually become cab drivers, all the different ethnic groups over the period of years, and thousands of languages being spoken on one street corner. And so to a certain extent, it is the idea of America really being worked out with everyone, different races, colors, and creeds working together and living together in the same city.
It's a touching spectacle. We'll come back when you're ready for us.
The past is the torch that lights our way. Where our fathers have shown us the path.
To imply the I should say, the combination of the church and the Irish community, making it the only time you see Bill the Butcher in the film turn away is when he sees them all together at that church. He knows he can't fight that, and that implies the relationship of the church is so important in the Irish American community and how it helped establish the Irish American identity here in America.
Across the sea, for with great numbers must come great strength and the salvation of our people.
How many other men live here? You all have to register.
You can't force me to join no army.
Have you got $300?
Of course not. Who the hell's got $300?
If you are drafted, release from military service can only be secured for $300 according to the conscription act.
$300?
Otherwise, you have to
Who the
serve.
hell's got $300,
You have to serve,
eh?
by the
You tell
president's
me.
order, unless you have $300.
Go back to where you came from, you bastards!
I am born in this country, sir. You emigrated here. You will fight for this country, sir.
Wait, Jesus, war does terrible things to men.
Get back uptown where you belong. $300. So it's another rich man.
One of the things one has to understand is that one of the reasons the picture hasn't got made for so many years is because the nature of the look of the film. None of that exists in New York anymore. Even when I did Age of Innocence, which takes place in the 1870s in New York, hardly any of it, certainly in exteriors, exist without having to CGI out skyscrapers around. Very little of that exists now. Some interior exists, but nothing really of the 5 Points and that kind of Wild West feeling, the kind of frontier town feeling downtown. Right around Wall Street. Wall Street was, of course, very different. And where the richer and the upper class lived was about 5-6 blocks away on Great Jones Street and other streets. Very different streets. But in the area where the poor were, it was hardly, it was like a shanty town, no sanitation, epidemics, cholera epidemics, overcrowding, crime. Looking at all this, I had to put this together in my mind, and fortunately I've been working in the past 10 years with Dante Ferretti, who had worked in with the great Italian directors Fellini and Pasolini and so many others in Italy, in Rome. And I have a sort of close connection with Italian cinema, being Italian-American, and being heavily influenced by neorealist films in the late 40s and the Italian New Wave in the late 50s all the way through the 60s, through the 70s, from Fellini and loving Antonioni's films and Pasolini's films, of course, and his writing, and Bertolucci and Bellocchio and so many others, Visconti and Marino Olmi, all these people. So that a lot of these films also in Italy, some of the greatest films that I was just passionate about, were all shot in Cinecittà, which was the great film studio that Mussolini built in the 30s in Rome. And which I think during the war, towards the end of the war, was reduced to a barracks for soldiers, and then became after the war was over, became a refugee camp, etc. But the most extraordinary sets, the most extraordinary studio buildings are there. One is called Stage 5, which is gigantic, in which Fellini shot most of his films and created most of his sets there. Dante worked with him in his later films. And Godfather 2 was shot there. So many great films were made there. And that tradition of Italian craftsmanship and artistry was something that I really always, I was looking for an excuse to find a way to be able to work there with them. And Dante, when we just started discussing this film, came up with a plan, along with Cinecittà itself, because they renovated the studios, to give new life to the studio, to bring in more business from around the world, to create this world of New York at a good price. And this all worked out with our investors and our backers and the studio.
Why should so many Irish die down south when the first war to win is knocked down in Dixie?
We took some of Jacob Riis's photographs of the slums of New York from the 1870s, but I just took elements of that because we're dealing with the 5 Points in the 1850s, early 1860s. Some buildings built on top of outcrops of rock. I then took that idea, like for example, the outcrop of rock has the barbershop on top that Monk McGinn surveys the neighborhood from. That came from a photograph, and I imagined that we could move that rock and put it there and that sort of thing. Also, I imagined the Satan Circus, Bill's place, that I wanted to give the appearance of a place that was being built with no plan. There's no plan down there. They just built things as they needed it. It was horrible. There was no sanitation. And so behind the bar is a wall of rock with a tree, the roots of a tree emerging from it and covering over the bar. They just kept building around it,
And so it was a place in the works, so to speak. It was a frontier town, only without wide open spaces. It's all claustrophobic instead. And what you have really in Gangs of New York is kind of upsetting to say, but it may be the last, sets of this size may be the last you'll ever see in a film. From now on, it'll probably be more CGI, computer generated. But I don't think sets like this will ever be built again. And the scale of the sets, the exterior sets. Interior sets, yes, of course, there'll be bigger sets. But the exterior was the whole area of downtown New York.
So that if we wanted to do a scene inside Satan's Circus, let's say, which was Bill the Butcher's place, and we wanted to change it to the barbershop, which was Monk McGinn, that was his place, it was all ready to go because it was all pre-lit, it was ready to go, and we had, we just felt that was our place. And people would say, oh, Marty, you spent almost a year in Rome, pre-production and shooting, it must have been great. I said, no, I was in New York. I was in New York. I was living at the 5 Points, in effect. I got in a car, went to a house, they took me back. I didn't go anywhere else. I went to a few dinners, but that's 10 months. The actors, when they get there, it's a real place. The more the weather hit us, the better the buildings looked. You know, the mud in the street got worse. The pigs got bigger. They were small, the pigs at first. Then they got really big after about a month or two. So we had to bring in new ones. But, you know, it was very much a feeling of being at home in a way. George Lucas was there visiting me when he was shooting Star Wars in Caserta in Italy. And he came by, and he loved the sets. He was impressed by them greatly. Then he had an assistant with him. He says, get a picture of the two of us. And it was on the corner of the 5 Points. There was nobody in the streets. It was in pre-production. And it was a wide shot, and George on one side, me on the other. And Paradise Square in the background, all the buildings in the background. And took the picture, little snapshot. And he said, on one side is the old, the other side is the new. Of course, he's the new, in the sense that these sets will never be built again. And he said that ultimately, everyone will realize that it's going to be ultimately cheaper to do them on CGI. And eventually, sets like this are just going to be impossible to make in terms of money. But he really felt that it was wonderful, and it was like stepping back into the beginnings of making movies, like in the early 20th century. Silent films had gigantic sets also, you know. Certainly not as big as Intolerance, but some did have very, very massive sets, films made in France in the silent period.
That, my friends, is the minority vote. Now you tasted my mutton. How'd you like it, huh? Look, I want you to see this. This is you, right here. Notch 45, you Irish bug bastard.
Now, the costumes are very important because it was a very colorful period, particularly of the underworld. And I think we have many records of what the upper classes and what the middle classes wore, but only few about of the lower classes in the criminal world or the underworld. We have many descriptions of them, though, and we get the idea. We have the idea that the gangs themselves, there were so many gangs down there, that it's a very simple thing, and that is the uniform that they would make up, in effect, the colors they would wear, that they'd be able to see, one gang member be able to see another gang member coming down the street, and he or she would know who they were and who they're affiliated with, and because it was that tense, you see. So, for example, in the case of the dead rabbits, we knew that through research that they used red stripes. In some cases just down the side of the pants, another case across the shirt. And ultimately, when we did the dead rabbits, particularly for the end of the film, we used, Sandy Powell came up with the idea of doing the red stripes in a primitive way, doing it themselves with paint on whatever shirts they had available as a symbol, in a way. The Bowery Boys were much more elegant. They had stovepipe hats, red fire shirts, black frock coats, check pants or plaid pants, and tall boots, long boots. And so and what they called soap locks. Their hair was matted down in a special kind of shiny, they used to call patent leather hair in the 30s. And these were the Bowery Boys, very well known. Plays were written about them in the 1840s, 1850s. And so we took that, and then we took the names of the gangs, and imagine ones that we did not have an idea of what their costumes would have looked like. We took from the name, and Sandy came up with different ideas, a certain kind of hat, a certain way of walking, the shirt tails. We sort of elaborated on the shirts being outside the pants, making them longer than they would have been in reality. So that we've heightened the fantasy of the place. But I think there's no doubt about it. I think no matter what we do in a film, it's probably much more, who knows, much more intense if we had been there to really see what these were like. There were so many things that she came up with that way. The engravings in the Civil War photographs were just something that we thought people, that's how they got their news, really, in a sense. They saw these, there were Leslie's Weekly, I believe, and of course Harper's Weekly, and a number of others, where there were, and also the, later, I believe, the Police Gazette, which was a real sort of, like the tabloid of the time, and more like the Inquirer today, but they were very honest about it, what people felt about the world they were living in at that time. How should I put it? They had no compunction about denigrating any race that was in New York at the time, and all this sort of thing. And so you find it to be very vivid and very, very lurid in a way. And so we wanted to use a few more engravings in the film. We tried, but it got to kind of stop the entire picture in terms of the flow of it. So I pulled some back, and then I used just some of the Civil War photographs that Matthew Brady and his group of men took on the battlefields, just to have a touch of it, because the thing is that it's the first time war was photographed. And when they started to see those photographs, around 1863, I guess, or so, maybe 62, it was hard to continue the war, and that's one of the reasons the draft was instated in New York, to get those men to go in. And of course, as I say, the draft riots are the worst riots in American history. Probably the worst loss of life until September 11th in New York.
The O'Connell Guard, the Plug Uglies.
As for us,
Party thieves.
the tribes were gathered.
The Chichesters.
The drums was beaten.
Dead rabbits.
The American Guard. The Atlantic Guard. The Slaughterhousers. The Bowery Boys. Confederation of American Natives. James Mooney.
But all we could see.
I believe it was Broadway and 29th Street. I may be wrong, where the draft office was to be ready to be called out, the names to be called out from the draft. And I believe the first drawing, I think it was in the daytime, early in the day, didn't cause any violence. I think it was the second one. And that came from one of the fire gangs. And there was one called the Black Joke that a few members, I believe, their names had been called out in the draft earlier that day. And in the second meeting, in which there was a big crowd, and the moment that the names were being called out, the Black Joke broke the windows and created a demonstration. I don't think any of them had in mind what was going to happen. I think they were there basically to protest that 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5, I'm not quite sure, of their gang members, or brigade members, I should say, were drafted, and they felt it was unfair. And that began a series of events that just went out of control. A lot of the Irish gang members did join up originally, but by 1863, not many guys were joining. And when the draft was announced, it was the first draft in American history, or Union history, and a lot of these people came from Europe to escape what they considered unfair, the injustice of certain drafts that were initiated in Europe and certain countries. And so the reality was that they didn't think anything like that could happen here. At first, a lot of people joined up. Within 2 years, nobody had realized the war was going to take that long, and it was going to be that costly in human terms. And particularly, one has to understand the 19th century in America is the most violent century in the history of America. Not the history of the world, but in America. And the Civil War has a lot to do with that.
I saw them. I don't know what to think.
Now, what is it that you are so fond of saying, Mr. Tweed? And, Mr. Greeley, you won't like this, but what is it?
I don't remember.
You can always hire one half of the poor to kill the other half.
I come to say goodbye. I've booked passage for California.
Jenny, give me one more day and I'll go with you.
You'll be dead by then.
Well, what would you have me do?
I don't know. No, it won't. This whole place is gonna burn anyway.
One of the reasons I was fascinated by the draft riots was the extent to which the struggle was expressed by the people who could not do anything about it. And the only thing they could do was let themselves be heard through violence, unfortunately. It wasn't an organized attack or riot. Within 2 or 3 days, the worst elements of the mob was still running around hanging people and lynching African Americans. But the reality was that at first they thought it was maybe a Southern-inspired and maybe British-inspired, too, attack on the city as part of the Civil War. In effect, the Civil War does come to New York in 1863 because of that. But it seems to be more of a logical progression of a country that's trying to pull itself together, the social ills, the nature of the anarchy of the inner city itself. It seems to be something that basically was a powder keg ready to go. And the only thing that was needed was that one little, somebody light that fuse, and that was the draft notice itself, the draft, the creation of the draft itself, in which it was stated that you could avoid the draft if you had enough money to pay your way out, which was done in a very, done through lawyers and that sort of thing, for $300, or you could send a substitute. A lot of rich people send substitutes. And so the poor had no other recourse at that point. But what's important is that when you think of this, it's why I say that it seemed to be an expression of anger, an expression coming from 20 or 40 years of, in a sense, social injustice, failures of the city to pull together to deal with the poor, deal with the needy. They sort of avoided the issue in a way, and it all exploded with the excuse of the draft. And it's important to know that once the draft riots were over, a few months later, I think it was a few months later, Lincoln reinstated the draft, and there wasn't one remark against it from the poor. They just had blasted all that energy and just gave in.
Precinct. The mob are sacking houses 27th Street and 7th Avenue. We have no force to send. 16th Precinct. All the stores are closing on 8th Avenue from fear of the mob in 17th Street.
Show us what you've got, you cowardly bastards!
From 4th, the rioters are attacking colored boarding houses, robbing them, and setting them on fire.
From 21st, the mob have just broken open gun store on 3rd Avenue and are arming.
Get the nigger! Kill him!
Marshal's office on 3rd Avenue is burning down. The police is of no avail. Two colored men brought in almost dead.
There are 50 more Negroes outside who need help. The blacks are being attacked all over the city.
Hey! There's a $300 man! Get him! Did your daddy buy you out of the army? Can he buy me out of the army too?
There is danger of mob attacking Armory, corner 21st Street, 2nd Avenue. There's about 500 stand of arms in it.
The line is dead. They're trying to cut all the wires.
From 1st, riot at Pier 4, North River. They have killed Negroes there. A crowd is here and are going to destroy this station.
Get her bag! Get her bag!
From 18th Precinct, the mob have attacked the Armory, 2nd Avenue, 21st Street. There is danger of firing the building.
All 300 police wounded or unaccounted for. Find the military and...
From 20th, send 100 men to disperse mob assailing Mayor Updike's house.
Building corner 33rd Street, 2nd Avenue, set on fire by the mob.
Barnum's American Museum on fire. Animals are escaping.
Let go!
Gunboat Liberty and ironclad Passaic now lying off the foot of Wall Street. They are ready to open fire on the mob. Now going down 5th Avenue to attack...
Barnum's Museum burned. Burned twice, and I don't believe it was during that period. It wasn't during the draft riots itself. But what I was trying to get across, the reference to a sense of the anarchy and the chaos of the period, and the city and the country being up for grabs, so to speak. And these were images that came to mind from the real Barnum's Museum fire, I believe it was a little later, but also from the sense of when a city breaks down, when all civilization breaks down. I wanted to give that impression at that point. And there were some diaries written about the fall of Berlin in 1945, which described the animals of the zoo, the Berlin Zoo, running wild in the streets during the bombardments, the leveling of the city. And it reminds me of when I like to read about ancient history. I like to read about the rise and the fall of civilizations, of cities, and to put ourselves in that mindset that we're not here forever and that we shouldn't take anything for granted. And it could easily fall to a situation where anarchy and chaos reigns again.
I think what happens is that the film and the depiction of that time, the way I wanted to depict it, a combination of historical fact and imagination, which some people agree with, some don't. But I wanted to do it that way. And then it became, over the many years, an obsession. And once you have that obsession there, it's almost as if you're given, I don't know, the greatest, I don't mean the word toys, but you're given something that you could create. And it's there, and all these years you've been dreaming of it. And so there's a great deal of excitement and a great deal of trepidation, fear. But with people like Ballhaus, Dante Ferretti, Vic Armstrong, Joe Reedy, and the rest of my crew, they're moving ahead like an army. And they're excited. And that only makes me more excited. So in my mind, I could probably still be shooting the film now, as we speak, 2003. Because I could keep going down the street. Let's do a scene in this. Let's do a scene in this building. Let's do a scene in that building. In my mind, it was really. There's no doubt that even being on the sets, we felt it was a very specific city. It was real. It became real to us, myself and the actors. Basically, we could create our own world, and we had a base of certain extras that were there every day. They became part of it too. So in the morning when you're there, they're all walking around. They're in costume during the time warp. You know, I don't say it was easy. It was probably the hardest thing we've ever done, next to The Last Temptation of Christ. But as I say, I could go back and continue shooting and do another story or another aspect of it. Thelma Schoonmaker has been editing every film with me, including some documentaries since Raging Bull. That's 1979, 1980. Prior to that, I knew her we met at New York University, where she took a summer course. And then we worked together on Woodstock, where she was the main editor, and Michael Wadley was the director and one of the editors. I was an editor after her. I was a third place editor, so to speak. But in any event, then she went away for quite a long period of time, and I worked from Mean Streets on with other editors. And I edited the films myself. Boxcar and Mean Streets were edited by myself. And I just thought it would be interesting to bring her in, and she wasn't even in the union at the time, and she had to get into the union for Raging Bull, and then ultimately she won an Academy Award for it. And so we just know each other, and she's tenacious in dealing with the emotion of a scene, memorizes the rushes and also memorizing the order that I prefer them. And so if I become tired, I find usually that she is a person who will go after a scene and say, "But I think I remember another take that you liked, but you put in third place that might help us here." I go, "Well, go ahead, put it in. Let's see." She's very good that way, and also reconstructing some of the structure ultimately. And in certain films I make, the writing extends into the editing, in a sense. Gangs is one of them. Casino is another. Age of Innocence to a certain extent, and all this goes on. So she's also able to help that way. And one of the things she does, or doesn't do really, is read the script. So that when the rushes come in for the first day, she doesn't know what the film's really about. In a sense. I mean, she has a general idea. But this way I have a cold, objective point of view. I said, very often I find that an overall a scene that I'm directing. I mean, very often I find a scene I directed and shot has one major storytelling component in it. And sometimes when I choose the takes and that sort of thing in the rushes, she puts it all together for me. And I find that she's going according to what I've told her to do. But as we move forward, I ask her, wait a minute, did you know that this scene is supposed to show such and such? She goes, oh, no, I didn't get that. And I said, well, how could that happen? That happens invariably. They say, you don't understand that he's delivering a letter to someone? No, I didn't quite get that. What do you think? Well, don't tell me you have to go do a close-up of the letter. I mean, that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's just an example, but I find sometimes that happens, and it's refreshing to know, even when you've covered all your bases, you think you've covered all your bases, that, if it's still not registering, then I have to think of going another way. That's a general comment, basically, and this was a very difficult film for us to edit. It was like a giant piece of sculpture that we kept chipping away, and I kept changing my mind and a lot of different things. I kept a track of every screening and how long the film was. Normally, Thelma Schoonmaker and myself screened the picture 8-9 times. Cut number 1, I believe, was, forget the date, but it was 3 hours and 38 minutes. That was our assembly. That was everything we knew in the kitchen sink thrown in, But did it work? No. So 2 days later, I recut it, and it came down to 3 hours and 37 minutes. I cut out 1 minute. There were 18 screenings, ultimately, of the film. 18 screenings, and there's not one version that I would say that's my original version. This was all series of changes and rewrites and restructuring at times, till finally, it's come down to the movie you see in the theater. Leonardo DiCaprio and I did, I think it was the Today Show. No, it was an NBC, I think it was Katie Couric. Right before the film opened, Leo and I did this interesting interview, I thought, in McSorley's old ale house. It was the day of one of the first big snowstorms in New York. After we did the interview, they took us downtown, and we were going to walk around what's left of the 5 points. There's only 2 corners left, and one of the areas is taken over by the Motor Vehicle Bureau, which is apt, I think, considering what the 5 points was like. But there's a little park called Christopher Columbus Park, I believe, and that's the old square. That's the little Paradise Square. It's still there, but there's only 2 corners left, and we stand in those corners in that little episode that we did for the Today Show. But it's quite funny because the snow was so thick and fast that it was sort of like the retreat from Russia we were walking through. I couldn't see a thing, but it was the day we had to go down and do it. That was it. That was the only day they could photograph it, and I had to go on the air. But it's telling that New York, when it finally got itself established, wiped away the 5 points and created the Federal District down there. All the Greco-Roman, all the buildings of Greco-Roman architecture that deal with the courts and the tombs, the prison down there. Basically, it's what runs the city.
It was 4 days and nights before the worst of the mob was finally put down. We never knew how many New Yorkers died that week before the city was finally delivered.
From way back in that very first draft in 78, 79, that was the way it ended. We knew that we were diehard New Yorkers, and it had to end with the skyline being built. It just had to. In fact, we had a second part of the story that we wanted to do, which was the building of the Brooklyn Bridge and how the bridge linked Manhattan to the rest of the country, or vice versa. And so it had to end with that. We just couldn't resist it. The thing about it, of course, that was we did that painting, and I should say a series of dissolves and paintings before September 11th. And right after it, I thought about it, and, we're making a film. I felt that taking out the towers was not the right way to go. I thought we should leave them in. The people in the film, good, bad, or indifferent, were part of the creation of that skyline, not the destruction of it. And if the skyline collapses, ultimately, we're aware of the struggle of humanity, if there's any left, building up another one. I think this is the sense of time going by, the sense of civilization changing, and primarily the idea of
the city that we know now coming out of this extraordinary struggle, which not many people really know about. And so I felt it was more, I felt it would have been right to go in and keep revising New York skyline in movies, erasing the two towers. That was the way I left it.
Well, for those of you who watched up to now, I have to thank you for viewing the DVD of Gangs of New York. Thank you.
It's a long way we've come from the freckled hills to the steel and glass canyons, from the stony fields to hanging steel from sky. From digging in our pockets for a reason not to say goodbye. These are the hands that built America. I saw your face in a watercolor sky. As seabirds argue a long goodbye. I took your kiss on the spray of the new light star. You gotta live with your dreams, don't make them so hard. And these are the hands that built America. Of all of the promises, is this one we can keep? Of all of the dreams, is this one still out of reach? It's early fall. There's a cloud on the New York skyline. Innocence dragged across a yellow line. These are the hands that built America. These are